So, I want to take you through the top 10 signs that you might be a fearful avoidant attachment style. And what I often find happens more than anything else is when people are first learning about attachment styles and attachment theory. And if you're not familiar, by the way, attachment theory is essentially the subconscious set of rules that you've learned how to relate to others with. And it's almost like sitting down and playing a board game, and you have the rules for Scrabble, somebody else has the rules for Monopoly. Like there's going to be a lot of unnecessary friction and problems. And the same thing happens with our attachment styles. They're sort of the styles through which you give and receive love, through what you expect to happen in relationships, through what your needs are in relationships, what your natural state of boundaries are with one another. And if we have different rules, there's going to be a lot of friction. And the biggest thing I find with fearful avoidant attachment styles in general, also referred to as disorganized attachment styles or anxious avoidant attachment styles. And yes, they do have three different names when it comes to attachment theory that have sort of adapted over time and throughout the last generations, especially since attachment theory has been studied for basically the last a little over 100 years. So essentially, these dynamics with fearful avoidance is that they often start off thinking they are anxious preoccupied. So what I'm going to take you through is the top 10 signs that you might be fearful avoidant. And we're going to really hone in during these top 10 signs on some of the differences between fearful avoidance and anxious preoccupied so that you can see, like, just because you are activating sometimes or fearing abandonment at times doesn't necessarily mean that you are just anxious preoccupied. So we're going to really clarify some of those tidbits between FAs and APs in this video. So the very first sign is that you may find yourself, and this is one of the big differences from anxious preoccupieds, flip-flopping back and forth between fearing abandonment and commitment. I think of the fearful avoidant as like the pendulum swinging. And you may find yourself as a fearful avoidant one day feeling this like fear of losing somebody and really having strong feelings. And literally the very next day or even that same day, thinking, wait, I'm scared. I'm scared of committing. I'm scared of feeling trapped. I'm scared of feeling too vulnerable to this person, and starting to really have these doubts. And that strong flip-flopping is literally because of your attaching in childhood or whichever past relationship caused you to be a fearful avoidant. So generally, we develop our attachment style between the ages of 0 to 2. But because of neuroplasticity, things are getting reprogrammed and reconditioned throughout our lives, but it has to be significant enough. So we can also have a really substantial adult romantic relationship where maybe you were AP and then you had a lot of trauma going on in that relationship and you actually turned FA in your adult life. So this flip-flopping back and forth, if we just look at it from a childhood perspective, is that generally you had a lot of chaos in childhood one way or another. And that chaos led you to, and I'll just use one example, but it can be many different variations of this. One example could be that you had a parent who was an alcoholic. And let's say one day the parent was sober and they were nice. And another day they were sober, but they were going through withdrawals and they were really mean. And then one day they were drinking and they were really warm and nice because they have a couple drinks in them. And another day they were drinking and they were really mean and cruel. And that constant inconsistency that's just so unpredictable leads that person, when they're learning to attach to that parent, leads that person to one day feel like there's great things about love and connection, and another day to just really fear it. And so they learn these simultaneously different and really opposing themes about the same thing. They learn that love is great and loving and warm and kind, and it's terrifying at the same time. And that can also be because parents are fighting a lot in the home, or there's chaos, or there's, there can be so many different variations. But, I think that parent drinking is just a really clear illustration of these competing associations about love. Love is wonderful and love is terrifying. And it leads fearful avoidance in their adult life until they do reprogramming around this to feel like I want this thing and it really scares me. And that's the experience of them flip-flopping between wanting connection and fearing commitment and sort of fearing like, oh my gosh, am I going to be trapped though? Or when will the other shoe drop, or what bad thing will happen? And so they can really go from, and this is point number 2, okay, of our 10. Point number 2 is that they can really go from activating, like fearing abandonment and trying to get closer and closer in proximity to the person they're seeing, to then deactivating, right? Fearing distance and really trying to sort of push somebody away either through withdrawing or even through actively pushing them away, which is something fearful avoidance will do, like saying something harsh or saying something mean or doubting the relationship or making a comment to try to, again, create distancing between themselves and another person. So those are our top first two. We've got many other ones, not necessarily in any particular order of top, just those are the first two. Number three is that we'll often find fearful avoidance really jumping to conclusions. I've often heard, and I was fearful avoidant, and I literally think of this, but I've heard this many times in my client practice over the last decade, which I heard I had a relationship before I did a lot of work on my own attachment style and healed and became secure. And I had a past relationship in my late teens, early 20s, where somebody said to me all the time, "You always jump the gun. You're always jumping the gun. You're jumping to conclusions." And then I proceeded when I started working with people to hear that expression from the partners of fearful avoidance all the time. And it's like, oh, you're just assuming bad things will happen. You're jumping to conclusions. You're jumping the gun. And what that actually reflects is if there's a lot of chaos in the home growing up, for example, going back to that example with the parent who was drinking, what ends up happening is you're kind of forced to jump the gun and look at worst case scenarios because there's these extreme events taking place. And so the mind will jump to assuming extremes because it actually gets conditioned to do so. And as a result, we'll often see somebody who's fearful avoidant in the way they attach to others, seeing incongruencies. They're very hypervigilant. They've become like their attachment strategy, basically, because of chaos in a variety of potential different forms. Their attachment strategy is to be hypervigilant, is to be super good at reading between the lines, to notice immediately if something's off in any which way, shape, or form. But then they tend to jump to worst case scenario conclusions. And that's a protective mechanism. That's something that protected them as children, but may not necessarily be serving them in their adult life and can actually cause a lot more friction and miscommunications in relationships. And so it's really related to trust at the end of the day, and an adaptive strategy to try to deal with feeling afraid, feeling like there's chaos and worst case scenarios happening. And so that can manifest in adult lives as suspicion, jumping to conclusions, jumping the gun, all those different things. Our next one, number 4, is you are terrified of feeling helpless. I would say when fearful avoidants really look within themselves, there's this really big fear of feeling out of control. And fearful avoidants may deal with that fear and try to mitigate it within the relationship to themselves through controlling their environment, through controlling themselves a lot, their routines, what they do, how they show up. Or they may just feel a lot of emotional dysregulation when they feel helpless. And the idea that they have to rely on somebody else to get their needs met makes them feel very afraid. And again, when we reel this back towards past relationships, what do we see? Well, usually when you were in a chaotic environment, there was an element of you having to rely on unpredictable individuals to get your needs met, which can leave you feeling really helpless. So because of that conditioning and programming that's now there at a subconscious level, as the fearful avoidant grows up, there's this fear of going back there again, right? This fear of like, oh my gosh, what if I have to be dependent on somebody else again? So we'll see that manifest in this person's adult life through being afraid to ask for help, through being afraid to give up too much control, give up too much freedom or independence, because it's all at a deeper level to avoid this fear of helplessness that's been embedded there because of conditioning from past experiences. Our next one is that we see fearful avoidants generally tend to be highly empathetic or sympathetic towards other people. There is a big difference between sympathy and empathy. I won't go into it too much, but sympathy is we tend to project onto others what we think they're feeling. We imagine their feelings according to what we would feel. Empathy is more we see them and know them and learn what they might be feeling according to what we understand about them. So for a very small example, without diverting too much, because it's an important point, sympathy might be if I'm afraid of being abandoned in this situation, you must be afraid of being abandoned. But with a fearful avoidant, let's say they're dating a dismissive avoidant or a different attachment style, they might assume that person's fearing abandonment when there's an argument, but maybe that person actually needs space. And so empathy would be, oh, I know that my partner tends to need space in an argument. So when they say they need space, they're not actually saying it to test me and because they're fearing abandonment and they want me to come closer. They're actually saying it because they need space. And so there's this ability to see others not as we are, but as they are, as we come to try to understand them. And FAs tend to experience a good bit of both of these. They can be really good at empathizing, and they can also be, and I would say in their early days before doing some work, tend to be a lot more sympathetic. And so they can really take on other people's emotions. They have very permeable boundaries in their emotional boundary environment. They tend to sort of really be the helpers, the ones that try to assist and show up and take on people's emotions and fix things for them. And again, where do you think this comes from? Often this comes from the type of environment they were conditioned within. And this often means in childhood or past relationships or experiences that were really impactful, where there was this sense of, I need others to be okay so I can also be okay. Like almost like if we go back to that original example, it's, I need my parents to stop drinking so I can be safe. So I need to do everything I can to caretake for this person's emotions so they don't drink and become more unpredictable. And so there's this dynamic that this FA gets conditioned with, where it's like, if others are not okay, I won't be okay. It's going to be more stress for me. So there's a lot of energy put into making others okay. And that tends to be a big part of the fearful avoidance programming. Our next one, you tend to struggle with boundaries as a result of this as well. Often fearful avoidance will be boundaryless, will pour into other people, and then eventually they'll feel taken advantage of. And again, like these are some differences from APs. APs are not so afraid to rely on others. Going back to that earlier one, they're not always jumping to conclusions that bad things will happen related to trust in general, though they do jump to conclusions around abandonment specifically. But with fearful avoidance, they tend to be boundaryless and then eventually get frustrated and upset and feel like they have to go into that avoidance side and push people away. Whereas APs will just keep trying to maintain proximity and closeness. And we've got FAs who are, they'll be boundaryless, and then eventually they'll sometimes get angry and even struggle with like saying harsh words, or again, like deactivating, trying to push people away, either through indirect pushing people away, like withdrawing, or actually pushing people away with telling them to go away, saying something mean over a text message, or things of that nature. Our next one is, you may experience a lot of really strong emotions and have a hard time regulating them. Sometimes you'll express these emotions towards others. Sometimes you'll just kind of like take them in yourself. And those emotions will tend to be really intense. And you may find yourself, as a general rule, just feeling a lot of like anger, hurt, betrayal. The biggest emotions FAs struggle with are hurt, anger, betrayal. And I would say a sense of like feeling unsafe. And it's really like small bits of low level anxiety, but it tends to be quite pervasive. And you may even find, as a fearful avoidant, you have a hard time resting. You have a hard time like staying regulated, just being, just having peace and calm. And there's more of this all or nothing mindset that fearful avoidance tend to have. And we actually know from a lot of research that all or nothing thinking, it really goes hand in hand with trauma, because there's a lot more all or nothing extreme situations. And so we tend to perceive events that way as a result. And we really see this show up the most with fearful avoidant attachment styles. By the way, I'm going to go through 4 more points here. And if you want to do a deep dive into fearful avoidant attachment style, you can actually check out courses we have for free for 7 days, all about reconditioning. Because with attachment style specifically, if you don't do subconscious reconditioning work, if we just give like surface, like behavioral strategies, behaviors are actually effects of fears or unmet needs first. So I won't go too far down that rabbit hole right now. It's for another video, but if you pay close attention, if I have a story, if I believe that everybody's going to betray me, then that affects my actions and behaviors. And so when we're not first working on those subconscious stories, those narratives that we're carrying, those core wounds that we've been imprinted with, we have a hard time actually being able to create change that's really lasting and really works and is really sustainable. So we have to really engage the subconscious mind in reprogramming in the process, so that we can learn what our needs are, meet our needs. We can learn how to recondition core wounds. And it doesn't mean we're not cautious about things that we do. But when we can rebuild trust, for example, in a healthy way, a balanced way, it brings healthier behaviors into relationships, including the relationship to ourselves. So anyways, those all that you can check out the link down below. It has all the courses for fearful avoidance. We have like 2 or 3 we recommend in particular, and they tend to be really, really useful for reconditioning the style so you can have healthy and secure relationships. Okay, next one. You seem very vulnerable about things that you may not actually be vulnerable about. So fearful avoidants tend to build these one-way connections. Again, where do you think it comes from? Often the conditioned patterns in their childhood where they were meeting the needs of their caregivers to try to deal with the chaos in their environment, but their needs weren't necessarily seen or understood or met. But they did get some connection from doing so, right? They were positively reinforced enough for it to feel like it kind of meets a need for them to meet others' needs. So you'll often see fearful avoidants can be really good at building these one-way connections where they really draw out information from other people. They get people to open up. People really see them and open up to them. And you may see that you're really good at sort of harnessing that experience, but you either won't really open up much back, or if you do, you may find that and this brings me to our next point, number 8, you may find that you undershare and then sometimes overshare. So it may be like, again, this polarity where sometimes you won't really share much at all, and then you'll share a lot. Or the other variation of this experience is that you find yourself in a position where you will be vulnerable. You'll share vulnerable things, but you won't actually ever share anything you really feel vulnerable about. So maybe you'll share about like a painful past relationship, but if you did something that you felt was bad in that painful past relationship, you may like take that and keep that and not open up about that at all. And so it's like it's almost like this vulnerability to connect, but it's not necessarily you really opening up. And I do want to say that while we don't have to share everything with everybody, in our really close relationships, it is a part of how we feel loved. And when we share things that we do feel vulnerable about, we don't have to do it right away. But when we build trust and we do share more vulnerable things, and we will actually come to see the vast majority of the time that we still get accepted, we still get loved anyways. It really helps us feel more seen, more deeply understood, more deeply connected. Vulnerability really goes hand in hand with depth and real connection in relationships. Okay, we have 2 more. Number 9, you may find yourself struggling with extreme guilt and shame. Sometimes the guilt can be as a result of like getting angry and then kind of saying too much, or being triggered and then being harsh with your words and feeling really badly about it. And also that you may shame yourself and be really harsh to yourself in your own internal dialogue. Like your thoughts about yourself can be putting yourself down a lot. Again, sometimes this is because of the way you were talked to or the patterns you observed between how other people talk to each other in your environment. And often the dialogue we hear a lot in our home environment growing up, we internalize, and that becomes our own internal dialogue in our adult lives. And then last but not least, and I kind of mentioned this earlier as number 2, but it was supposed to be for number 10, we may find there's a strong activation-deactivation. So you may see that there's this dynamic of really going towards somebody and then getting afraid and then pulling away. And really going towards somebody and then pulling away again. And there's no specific like, oh, this is going to make you activate. You can fear abandonment and then you can deactivate. You can fear abandonment and be like, oh, I don't want to fear this from somebody. I don't want to feel this vulnerable to somebody. I'm going to shut down and pull away. Or you could fear abandonment and then try to activate. So it can really be all over the map in terms of that pendulum really swinging. So I hope this makes a lot of sense. Hopefully this really shows you some of the differences between anxious preoccupied and fearful avoidant. And you can check out those courses for free for 7 days using the link below. And you can also come into our webinars. I do webinars every single week with our students 4 times a week. You can come in, you can ask me questions, personal questions, camera on, camera off, type them in the chat, whatever you feel most comfortable doing. We host them so that you can come in and we can actually discuss. And I hope this was beneficial. Thank you so much for watching and for being here. Please like, share, and subscribe if you're enjoying this channel and got value from this video. And I will see you in the next video.